Americans have, for years, been fed a pack of lies about Israel and Palestine. These lies enabled successive administrations of both parties to offer nothing but unconditional support for Israel and nothing but unrestrained contempt for Palestinians. American presidents stood meekly by as the Israeli governments blatantly violated international law year after year. Israel aggressively expanded settlements in the West Bank, imposed a brutal blockade of Gaza-aided settler violence, passed apartheid-style laws, and used a vast bureaucracy to put a veneer of legality on seizures of Palestinian homes and land. Our support for this criminal and inhumane status quo was enabled by an elaborate mythology surrounding the so-called two-state solution. Now, there are a number of components to this myth. First, that Palestinians have received multiple generous offers of statehood and have unreasonably rejected them. Second, that the Israeli government would love nothing more than to come to some sort of a two-state peaceful resolution, but have no, quote, partner for peace. Every part of all of that is a lie. Fortunately, this mythology is actually crumbling in real time, killed by friendly fire, you might say, as Netanyahu himself has announced. Not only will he do everything in his power to block a Palestinian state forever, but that he is proud to have been a primary impediment to the dream of a peaceful settlement. In a press conference last week, he said the following, quote, "You and your journalist friends have been blaming me for almost 30 years for putting the brakes on the Oslo Accords and preventing the Palestinian state. That's true. I'm proud that I prevented the establishment of a Palestinian state because today everybody understands what that Palestinian state could have been now that we've seen the little Palestinian state in Gaza." Now, this, of course, is a transparent bit of blame shifting from Bibi. He would absurdly have you believe that those who supported the Oslo process were to blame for October 7th rather than him, the dude who promised you could keep Palestinians locked in a cage forever with zero consequence, who cynically built up Hamas as a Machiavellian means to an end of blocking Palestinian statehood, whose administration was so distracted by his own corruption scandals and pandering to extremist settlers that they completely ignored the October 7th planning that was happening right in front of their faces. But I rather appreciate Bibi's comments here nonetheless, because they are the beginning of the end of our national delusions about the two-state solution. Now, literally no one should be surprised that Bibi is bragging about blocking a Palestinian state. This has been his entire political program and raison d'etre for decades. But such comments and naked admissions rarely make it into the U.S. press. They're said in Hebrew for an Israeli domestic audience, and American politicians just pretend they didn't hear them. Or they pretend that Bibi is some outlier, a fringe political character inconsistent with mainstream Israeli politics. This is all false. In fact, Netanyahu gives himself far too much credit as the sole bulwark against a Palestinian state. In fact, the various Israeli prime ministers differ not in their opposition to an actual Palestinian state, but in their tactics for permanently blocking one. So first, it's simple enough to demonstrate that opposition to Palestinian statehood has been a permanent feature of Israeli politics, no matter the prime minister. Maybe most illustrative is this chart. Under every Israeli prime minister, moderate, liberal, or right-wing, from lionized hero Yitzhak Rabin to the odious Netanyahu, year after year, illegal settlement building continued, and the settler population exploded. Now, why, you might ask, is this a key fact? Because the entire purpose of these settlements is to block a Palestinian state. Don't ask me, ask the settlers themselves. One of their activist leaders was recently interviewed by Isaac Chotiner, and she explained it very plainly. Quote, "The world, especially the United States, thinks there is an option for a Palestinian state. And if we continue to build communities, then we block the option for a Palestinian state. We want to close the option for a Palestinian state, and the world wants to leave the option open. It's a very simple thing to understand." And she's right. It is indeed a very simple thing to understand. The consistent commitment to settlements under every single Israeli government exposes the lie that Bibi is somehow an outlier in his opposition. Now, here's another key fact in understanding the consistent opposition to Palestinian statehood. Let's allow Professor Norman Finkelstein to lay this one out.
Every year, every single year, the United Nations General Assembly passes a resolution called Peaceful Settlement of the Palestine Question. And every year, it lays out the terms which I just described. The terms of the settlement are anchored, embedded in international law. Every year, the vote is the whole world which is to say approximately 190 countries on one side embracing those terms, including the Palestinian representative organizations, and on the other side, it's usually the United States, Israel, and several South Sea islands, the Marshall Islands, Palau, Tuvalu, Tonga on the other side.
So next time you hear someone lazily parrot the mantra that Israelis have no, quote, partner for peace on the Palestinian side, you might challenge them on whether Palestinian extremists have really been the primary impediment to peace when the UN record here that Norm Finkelstein lays out is extraordinarily cut and dry. And just wait until they find out what the Likud party charter has to say about from the river to the sea. But you might say, what about Oslo? What about Camp David? Weren't Palestinians offered statehood through the Clinton negotiations? Weren't some Israeli prime ministers genuinely committed to this process? The answer is yes, some were committed to Oslo. But unfortunately, Oslo was never meant to achieve full statehood. Even the venerated prime minister, Yitzhak Rabin, assassinated by a Jewish extremist over Oslo, probably the most committed to this process of any prime minister, even he admitted he never envisioned a full Palestinian state. Interestingly, current Bibi senior advisor Mark Regev just explained this to Piers Morgan. Take a listen.
Yitzhak Rabin, the prime minister of Israel, who wanted to make peace with the Palestinians, who was the prime minister at the time of the signing of the Oslo Accords, he gave a speech and he was very clear. He said that the Palestinians will have less than a state. Yitzhak Rabin said, the man who was shot for his efforts to move forward on the peace process. He said that the future Palestinian areas will have to be demilitarized. He said the Jordan Valley, that area on the eastern edge of the Palestinian territories, would have to remain under Israeli control. The idea that a Palestinian area will have to be demilitarized in any future settlement, that's common sense.
Another important moment of honesty there. So what does he mean by less than a state, or state minus, as Netanyahu has called it? Well, Palestinian-American activist and intellectual Edward Said laid out in a famous piece what that has meant in opposing Oslo. He argued that far from a process to achieve statehood, Oslo envisioned placing Israeli security needs above actual Palestinian statehood and autonomy in perpetuity. This led Said famously to write, "Let us call the agreement by its real name, an instrument of Palestinian surrender, a Palestinian Versailles." So actual statehood was never on the table, but something short of that was, and plenty of Palestinians did support trying to achieve that negotiated settlement. Which brings us to the supposed conclusion of the Oslo tale as routinely recited by American politicians and media outlets. In their telling, Bill Clinton came tantalizingly close to a peace deal in 2000 at Camp David, only to see Yasser Arafat walk away from a generous offer over the smallest of differences. Now, at this point, you should be unsurprised to learn that this narrative is also nothing but invented ass covering to serve the Israelis and their American benefactors. To start with, the deal was very lopsided. Far from the generous offer that it's routinely presented to have been, it required extreme concessions from the Palestinians, including security demands, which would have divided the West Bank into 3 cantons, effectively continuing some of the worst parts of the Israeli occupation, creating not a state, but a series of Bantustans with no control over airspace, no military, no control over their own borders with Egypt and Jordan. Even one of the top Israeli negotiators, Shlomo Ben-Ami, later admitted, "If I were a Palestinian, I would have rejected Camp David as well." What's more, far from Arafat walking away, negotiations actually continued. Formal negotiations continued at Taba until right-wing Israeli governments were elected to kill the process entirely, and the rest, at least for our purposes today, is history. So to sum up, the deal was far from generous. Arafat had some good reasons to walk away, but he actually didn't, and it was the Israelis who put the final nail in the coffin of Oslo with help from extremists, let's be clear, on both sides. But don't take my word for it. As our own Ryan Grimm has been pointing out, the right-wing hawk, Zbigniew Brzezinski, set Joe Scarborough straight in spectacular fashion on the Camp David fairy tale many years ago. Take a listen.
You can't blame what is happening in Israel right now on the Bush administration.
Yes, you can.
No, you can't.
Well, look, Joe.
Let's go back to 2000, Dr. Brzezinski. You and I both know Bill Clinton gave Arafat and the Palestinians everything they could have wanted.
Such a stunningly superficial knowledge of what went on that it's almost embarrassing to listen to you.
Oh, is it?
If you were to look more closely at what happened, in the Clinton Camp David discussions, you would know that what we have just said is absolutely wrong. There were all sorts of provisions and catches to the so-called proposal, and it wasn't rejected. The negotiations went on in Taba, and then there were elections in Israel, and Sharon came in, and everything got aborted.
Now listen, I think it'd be fair to look at this history and say, even so, given what we know today, Arafat should have just taken what was on the table in 2000, because it's got to be better than the horror, pain, and bloodshed that we are witnessing. Very possible. I think it's also fair to point out that Palestinian violence in the Second Intifada in particular is what helped to turn the Israeli public away from those politicians promising a settlement and toward those openly advocating for brutality, leading to a parade of maniacs culminating in this Netanyahu government complete with overt genocidal psychos. But I think you can also see when you look at all of the facts, there were legitimate reasons for Palestinians to oppose Oslo in its entirety. It wasn't just extremists bent on genocide who found the framework unacceptable and sought to undermine it. Now, in some ways, this past is irrelevant, since the thing that really matters is what happens next. But if there's one thing that's clear to me, watching this conflict unfold, it's that the lies of the past, the narratives that color our understanding of this current moment, are the most potent weapon enabling the atrocities that are unfolding today. So let's take a cue from Bibi and drop all the fakery. Biden can say two-state solution as much as he wants. Israelis do not want one. So what now?